Did God promise Israel to the Jews? I think it's obvious that the Jewish state of Israel is absolutely central to many of the most important issues in geopolitics today. Of course, we have all the wars in the Middle East that the US and other nations have been involved in for several decades. Many would argue that the US has no legitimate interest in many of these countries. Among liberals, it's a popular opinion that it's about the oil. I don't completely disagree that oil is a factor, but it seems to me that they're not wars for oil nearly so much as they're wars for Israel. But I also don't see these two things as entirely unrelated. As many people know, after the US abandoned the gold standard, the petrodollar emerged as the world reserve currency. You might say we went off the gold standard and switched to the oil standard. There are definitely people out there who understand the global monetary system better than I do, so they're welcome to correct me if I'm wrong on this point, but it seems to me that the value of Federal Reserve notes is directly tied to the price of oil. Therefore, the Federal Reserve and the Rothschild-controlled global banking system has a very special interest in controlling oil prices. So to the extent that the wars in the Middle East are wars for oil, I think they are the wars waged by the international bankers and the House of Rothschild in order to control the price of oil, in order to control the value of their world reserve currency. The reason I say this is connected to the Jewish state of Israel is not simply because Rothschild and most of the other international bankers are Jewish, but more especially because the Jewish state of Israel was essentially created by Rothschild. I think most people are familiar with the Balfour Declaration. Basically, Britain promised Palestine to Rothschild in exchange for manipulating the US into getting involved in the war. If you're not familiar with the Balfour Declaration, you can research into it for yourself. I'm not going to go into depth on it here. My point is simply that oil, the international banking and monetary system, and the Jewish state of Israel are all very deeply connected. So I'm not going to argue over whether the wars in the Middle East are wars for oil, wars to benefit the international bankers, or wars for Israel. These are really just different ways of saying the same thing to anyone with a basic understanding of what's going on in the world. It is extremely complicated, and I won't claim to perfectly understand it myself, but I think the essential connections are easy enough to see. Some people are really focused on the fact that neocons are warhawks, and this is true, but why are they warhawks? I think it's worth mentioning that many of these neocons are Jewish and are dual citizens of Israel. And they very explicitly state that the reason why we must fight these wars is to defend Israel. Some people may wonder why the US must defend Israel. In my opinion, the answer basically comes down to the fact that the same people who created and control our central bank, the Federal Reserve, created and control Israel. So it's pointless to argue over the question of whether these are wars for Israel or wars to enrich the international bankers. This is mere semantics, and at the risk of being labeled anti-semantic, I don't see any value in fighting over semantics. The reason I'm talking about all of this is to highlight the importance of the question which is the main topic of this discussion. Did God promise the land of Israel to the people who call themselves Jews? Do Jews have some kind of divine right to this territory in the Middle East? Personally, like many rational people, I find the idea absurd that God has chosen a particular group of people as special on the basis of race, or on the basis of who their ancient ancestor or patriarch was. This is to accuse God of racism and nepotism. And I wouldn't be the first to point out the absurdity of believing that God would promise his chosen people a piece of land that is already inhabited by other people. If we can say that God gave the land of Israel to the Jews, and that therefore they have the divine right to drive out the Palestinians, then why can't we also say this about other groups? Next time someone says that Europeans stole America from the natives, tell them that God gave America to the British colonist. See how they respond. Yet many people accept this same absurd claim with regard to Israel. And how exactly are we supposed to verify such a claim? Maybe I think God told me that I can have your house. Does this mean I can forcefully evict you and move in? So a group of people who call themselves Jews claim that the land of Palestine is theirs because God gave it to them and their descendants forever. What is the actual evidence that this is true? Why should we take this claim any more seriously than my claim that God gave your house to me? Of course, at this point, I know a lot of people will tell me they believe it because it's in the Bible. And I think this is at the heart of American Zionism. I think this is why many Christians in the West have been tricked into believing that the people who call themselves Jews have a divine right to the land of Palestine. They believe the Bible, and they believe the Bible says that God promised the land of Israel to the Jews. But is this true? For the sake of the argument, I'm going to be as generous as possible. For the sake of the argument, I will accept, without evidence, the claim that God promised the land of Canaan to the ancient Israelites. Even if we think in those terms, which is already preposterous in my opinion, the question is, what specific lands were promised, and to which specific people? I'm not even getting into the question of whether the people who call themselves Jews are actually the descendants of the ancient Israelites, or whether they're Khazars. If any of my viewers aren't familiar with the Khazar theory, they can look into that for themselves. There are others who say that modern Jews are actually of the seed of Cain, rather than the seed of Jacob. If their claim to the land of Israel is based on God's promise to the ancient Hebrews, then in order to claim the promised land, I think they should be asked to prove their lineage. And like I said, different people have presented arguments against their claimed lineage. And even if we just accept their claim to be the descendants of the ancient Israelites at face value, you have to ask which tribe they are. Anyone can read the book of Joshua and see that when the 12 tribes invaded and conquered the land of Canaan, the land was divided up into different territories, and each tribe received certain specific territories as their inheritance. People who have read the Bible also know that the kingdom of Israel split after the rule of Solomon. They split into the 10 northern tribes of Samaria and the southern tribes of Judea. This is where the word Jew comes from. The 10 northern tribes of Samaria were taken captive by the Assyrians. They're known as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. They sort of disappear from history. So the people who call themselves Jews today are not from the lost 10 tribes of northern Israel or Samaria. If they are in fact descendants of the ancient Israelites, then they're descended from the southern tribes of Judea, or basically Judah and Benjamin. The southern tribes were taken into captivity by Babylon, but eventually were allowed to return. Now it's interesting to note that the general time period lines up with the time period when Pythagoras was said to be in Babylon. He may very well have learned the religion of the ancient Israelites from Hebrew priests he came into contact with there, just as he learned the Persian religion of the Zoroastrian Magi while he was there. And this seems likely, since Pythagoras seems to have been interested in learning the mysteries of every religion. And as a side note, an interesting question arises here. What is the relationship between Kabbalah and esoteric Pythagoreanism? Did Pythagoras learn the mysteries of the ancient Jewish Kabbalists and incorporate it into his own mystery school? Personally, I believe this is very likely the case, especially since I see the Kabbalistic tree of life and the Pythagorean Tetractys as essentially the same. But it also seems entirely possible that what later became Jewish Kabbalah was actually essentially influenced by Pythagoras. Although this would have been before Pythagoras actually opened his school, it's hard to say at what point his essential philosophical system was actually formed. By the time he made it to Babylon, he had already studied with many other teachers, and it's very likely that he had already formulated the core elements of his later doctrine. The origins of Jewish Kabbalah aren't exactly clear. I only present this as one possible hypothesis. Of course, according to Kabbalistic tradition, the Kabbalah was essentially the oral Torah given to Moses. This is important to note because modern Judaism is not the tradition of Moses. It's the tradition of the elders. Modern Talmudic Judaism is the tradition of the elders. This was the tradition of the Pharisees, who Jesus was always clashing with in the Gospels. He basically accused them of teaching a corrupt religion. And whatever else you may think about him, he seems to be a kind of reformer. And in my view, he was trying to restore the true religion of ancient Israel. So was Jesus a Kabbalist? In any case, he seems to have been part of the Essene community. And Josephus has a couple of interesting things to say about the Essenes. He says these men live the same kind of life as do those whom the Greeks call Pythagoreans. If you look at the Essene communities, and you look at the Pythagorean community, and compare them point by point, you'll find a lot of similarities. I've said before that I believe there is a strong connection between the Essenes and the ancient Pythagorean Brotherhood. Could the Essene community have been influenced by the teachings of Pythagoras? Could the Essenes even be a branch of the Pythagorean Brotherhood? If so, then would that make Jesus a Pythagorean? Is true Christianity essentially a Pythagorean sect? I don't have the final answers, but my research so far has led me to these tentative conclusions. If so, it has interesting implications, especially if, like me, you believe that Gnosticism, and not Catholicism, was the original Christianity. I see Gnosticism and Western Kabbalah as being closely related to Pythagoreanism, and even as possibly being offshoots of the Pythagorean tradition. But again, at least some of this is speculation. It isn't just wild speculation, though. It's reasonable speculation based on at least some fragmentary evidence. I've also speculated that Pythagoras could reasonably have been from the line of one of those lost 10 tribes of Samaria. But the topic of the 10 lost tribes is too much to get into here. But many researchers make the case that the 10 lost tribes of Samaria became the Cimmerians or Cimmerians and Scythians, and eventually the Anglo-Saxons. This is what I personally believe at this time, but it's a topic I'm still researching. It's a hypothesis that explains a lot of things, and there seems to be a good bit of evidence supporting it. And it gets more interesting. Could the Cimmerians and the Cimmerians also be the descendants of the ancient Sumerians? These names definitely seem to share the same root word. It also seems to me that the Egyptians came from Sumer. The so-called Hebrews obviously came out of Egypt. So there seems to be several things that line up consistently with the hypothesis that I'm still in the early stages of formulating. One researcher, Ralph Ellis, whose work I greatly respect, is of the view that the Hebrews were Egyptians, racially speaking. And of course, we know from DNA testing of King Tut and other mummies that the ancient Egyptians are a genetic match with modern Anglo-Saxons. There was a news story a while back that reported that, according to genetic research, somewhere around 70% of modern ethnically British men are distantly related to King Tut. So this makes sense. if the Anglo-Saxon race descended from the Cimmerians, and if the Cimmerians were the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of northern Israel, or Samaria, and if these tribes were racially Egyptian, or in other words, Sumerian. And because I pronounce one with a soft C sound, Sumerian, and I pronounce the other with a hard C sound, Cimmerian, they sound different, so it's a minor difference in pronunciation, but is basically the same word. And notice that the word Aryan is in all of these terms. Sumerian, Sumerian, Cimmerian. Also keep in mind that Ireland comes from the same root and basically means Aryan land. There's so much more to get into than I can cover here, but I wanted to at least expose the tip of the iceberg. So let's look at something else that Josephus wrote about the Essenes, because it brings us back to the main question I'm discussing here. He describes 3 Jewish sects. He says, "For there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews, the followers of the first of which are the Pharisees, of the second the Sadducees, and the third sect, which pretends to be a severer discipline, are called Essenes. These last are Jews by birth, and seems to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have." Isn't it interesting that of these 3, he says that only the last of these, the Essenes, are Jews by birth. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees are not Jews by birth. And we've already said that their religion was Talmudic Judaism, or the tradition of the elders, or the Sanhedrin, not the tradition of Moses, not the Kabbalah. I do believe that some of these people later corrupted the teachings of the true Kabbalah, but they are not the origin of it, I don't believe. So they weren't Jews by birth, and we've already said that their religion was Talmudic Judaism, or the tradition of the elders, or the Sanhedrin, not the tradition of Moses. And we've already said that modern Judaism comes from the Pharisees. I'm stating facts here. This isn't speculation. Most people are just ignorant of these facts. So the Pharisees aren't Jews by birth, and they didn't follow the ancient religion of the real Jews. So who are they? In what sense can they even be considered to be Jews? Does this shed some light on the argument that Jesus got into with the Pharisees when he told them they're not sons of Abraham, but of their father the devil? Remember, Jesus was a real Jew. He was a Jew by birth, from the tribe of Judah. The Gospels record his genealogy. And he seems to have been a part of the Essene community, who Josephus identifies as the real Jews, those who are Jews by birth. Jesus also tells the Pharisees that their father was a murderer from the beginning. Cain? Understood properly, is this passage telling us that these people who called themselves Jews were not actually Jews, were not actually sons of Abraham at all, but were of the seed of Cain? Now, anyone who is familiar with the Gnostic tradition will know that the Sethians considered themselves to be the generation of Seth, or in other words, descendants of Seth, who is Adam's third son. And of course, Genesis talks about how there would be enmity between the sons of Cain, or the sons of the devil, and the sons of Adam, meaning the sons of Seth. So again, a lot of things seem to fit together here. Let me say clearly at this point that I do not believe the Bible is historically reliable, or that the stories of the Bible should all be taken literally. But I do think that the stories reflect an ancient oral tradition, and that they preserve a core of truth related to the history and ancestry of the true nation of Israel and other ancient peoples. Even if the details of the story of Cain and Abel and others aren't historically accurate, I do think that they are legends that grew around certain patriarchs. So even though I don't take the story of Noah's flood literally, let's look at it in terms of an account of ancestral lineage. Noah has 3 sons who become the fathers of 3 different nations. In other words, these different subracial groups share a common ancestor and are more closely related to each other than they are to the sons of Cain, for example. And of course, according to the Bible, the land of Israel, or Palestine, was not promised to the sons of Cain. It was promised to the sons of Jacob. If those who call themselves Jews are actually the sons of Cain, as Jesus and Josephus tell us, do they have any divine right to the land of Palestine? And like I said, this is without even getting into the Khazars. But even if we dismiss all of this, and assume that those who call themselves Jews today are actually descendants of the southern tribes of Judea, we're basically talking about the descendants of Judah and Benjamin. And like I said earlier, you can read for yourself exactly how the conquered lands of Canaan were divided up among the 12 tribes in the book of Joshua. Even if we believe that modern Jews are descendants of Judah and Benjamin, and even if we accept the idea that God promised certain lands to them, they could only at most claim the specific territories which were given to the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the Bible. They have no claim to the entire territory of Israel. Even if you accept biblical claims as valid, the Jews, the descendants of the kingdom of Judea, have no biblical claim to the territories which were given to the lost 10 northern tribes of Samaria. By the way, if the modern Anglo-Saxons do actually represent the descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Samaria, isn't it interesting that Rothschild made a deal with Britain for control of Palestine? Many people ask, what right did Britain have to give away Palestine? The hypothesis I'm presenting here makes this question far less confusing. And I believe that the elites, all of whom are obsessed with bloodlines, are very much aware of this. And I think this may shed some additional light on what was actually going on with the Balfour Declaration. So if we look at who actually promised Israel to the Jews, does it have anything at all to do with God's promise to the sons of Jacob, or does it have everything to do with the true sons of Jacob selling their birthright, much as Jacob tricked his brother Esau into doing? You have to love the poetry of that. And there is so much more to say about all of this. I've been putting off talking about some of this because there's so much to this that I wasn't sure where to start. I've hinted at some of this in other videos, but this is the most I've said on this topic so far. I still have a lot more to say. I've barely scratched the surface. And to be honest, I'm still working on filling in certain gaps in my analysis. And I'm usually reluctant to say anything at all until I feel like I at least understand the big picture, even if I don't see all the details of it with crystal clarity. This is one of the major topics that I'm focused on researching further at the moment. And as I've explained, I believe it's very relevant to the study of the Gnostic and Pythagorean tradition, and to the history and heritage of Western European people. So I'll have more to say on some of these topics in the future. But to answer the question, did God promise Israel to the Jews? My answer is no. If those who call themselves Jews even are the descendants of the ancient kingdom of Judea, which there is reason to doubt, then at most, they could claim that, according to the Bible, God promised a few specific territories within the land of Canaan to them. And those are the territories which were given to the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. God didn't promise all of Israel to the Jews. Britain did, in the Balfour Declaration. So I think I'll end there for now. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I think even people who are familiar with some of these things will have found some new insights in what I've presented. I encourage you to subscribe for more thought-provoking content like this in the future. My primary channel is now on BitChute at bitchute.com/Illuminatus Pythagoras, and you can also follow me on minds.com at The Semicircle. Please remember that I don't have sponsors and my videos aren't monetized. My channel and my work are 100% funded by myself and by viewers like you. And I want to say a special thank you to my small handful of patrons and supporters. They may not want to be recognized by name, but you know who you are. Thank you. Your support has helped me tremendously this month. This last week or so, it's literally meant the difference between eating and being hungry. In a recent video, I mentioned that I've made some sacrifices in order to structure my life more around being a full-time researcher. This channel is not my primary project at the moment, but it is a labor of love, and it's something that I hope to be able to devote more time and energy toward in the future, if I find the support I need to make that happen. Thank you again to everyone who supports my work, even if it's only by watching my videos, hitting the like button, and sharing them on social media. Peace.